The candles had burned low by the time dessert arrived. Clara Ashby counted the plates without meaning to. It had become habit, the way one learns to count steps on a dark staircase. 7 guests. 7 portions of lemon cake, pale yellow and glazed, carried in on a silver tray by a girl younger than herself. The girl set a plate before each guest: Lord Pembury, his wife, the Hartwell cousins, Cecily, who smiled as though the cake had been baked for her alone, Mrs. Hartwell, who did not smile but whose satisfaction sat on her face like a second skin. Then the girl reached Clara. She set down a small plate of bread. White bread, cut neatly, with a curl of butter on the side, as though that were a thing one served at dinner. Tatli sana e gelmes sevgilim. Mrs. Hartwell's voice was soft, concerned almost. Your digestion, you know, I am only thinking of you. Clara did not look up. She had learned that too, where to keep her eyes when the room was watching. The tablecloth, the bread, the curl of butter slowly losing its shape in the warmth. She did not look up, and so she did not see him, but she felt it. A stillness from the far end of the table, not the stillness of disinterest, something else, the kind of attention that has weight to it. When she finally raised her eyes just for a moment, just to breathe, he was already looking away. The Duke of Ashford, Edmund Cavendish. He had said almost nothing all evening. He reached now into his coat, produced a small leather notebook, and wrote something in it with the unhurried calm of a man making a note he intended to keep. Clara looked back down at her bread. She did not know then what he had written. She would not know for 2 years. By then, everything would be different. The Ashby name had once meant something. Clara had been told this so many times, and in so many tones: her father's pride, her mother's wistfulness, the quiet cruelty of people who mentioned it only to remind her how far it had fallen, that the words had worn smooth, like a coin handled too often. They meant nothing anymore. Or rather, they meant only this, that there had once been more and now there was not. Her father, Sir William Ashby, had died 18 months ago in a manner that was almost worse than scandalous, quietly, without drama, leaving behind a house mortgaged twice over, and a set of debts that surfaced one by one like stones in a receding tide. Clara had stood in the front hall of their London home and watched men carry out the writing desk her father had loved, and then the chairs, and then the portrait of her grandmother that had hung in the same spot for 40 years. Nobody was unkind about it. That was almost the worst part. They were efficient. She was 23. There was no mother dead of a fever when Clara was 11. No brothers. No near relations except for her father's sister, who had married a man named Hartwell and moved to Wiltshire and sent a card at Christmas and occasionally forgot too. The letter had arrived 3 weeks after the house was sold. My dear Clara, it began in Mrs. Hartwell's careful hand. In your present circumstances, it would be unnatural not to offer what comfort we can. You must come to Hartwell Park and stay with us. We shall consider it a family matter. Clara had read it twice, looking for warmth in it. There was none, but there was also nowhere else to go. Hartwell Park was large and well-appointed, and cold in the way that houses are cold when the people in them have decided, without ever saying so, that you are a guest of a particular kind, the kind that is useful. Clara learned the rhythms of it quickly. She was welcome at breakfast but not expected at dinner when guests were present. She was asked to help arrange flowers and oversee the linens and read aloud to Mrs. Hartwell in the evenings, which Mrs. Hartwell required for her nerves. She was not paid. It was a family matter. Cecily was 20 and had her mother's eyes and her father's certainty that the world would arrange itself to her advantage. She was not unkind to Clara, precisely. She was something more difficult to name. She was simply indifferent in the way that one is indifferent to furniture. Clara existed in her peripheral vision, no more. The talk that winter was of the Duke of Ashford. Clara heard it first from the housemaid and then from Cecily herself, who mentioned it at breakfast with the practiced carelessness of someone who has been thinking about it since waking. "They say he is coming to Wiltshire in the spring," Cecily said, not looking up from her toast. "Lord Pembury has invited him for the season. He is unmarried, you know, 31. The estate is well," she paused, "considerable." Mrs. Hartwell made a sound of agreement over her tea. Clara spread butter on her bread and said nothing. She had no opinion about dukes. She was thinking about the letter she had found that morning in her father's old traveling trunk, which had arrived with her things and which she had not yet had the heart to open fully. A letter in an unfamiliar hand, addressed to her father, dated 4 years ago. She had read only the first line before folding it away. "You must know, William, that I cannot allow this to continue." She did not know yet what it meant. But something in her, some instinct sharpened by 18 months of learning to watch and listen in a house that was not hers, told her to keep it. The spring came late to Wiltshire that year. Clara noticed it the way she noticed most things at Hartwell Park, from a window, at a remove, while doing something else. The gardens were still gray well into April, the rose bushes stubborn and bare, and Mrs. Hartwell complained about it as though the weather were a personal discourtesy. Cecily had new dresses made regardless. 3 of them, in colors that required sunlight to be properly appreciated. "One must be prepared," Mrs. Hartwell said, when Clara helped carry the boxes up from the dressmaker's cart. Clara was not asked if she required anything new. She wore her best dress, which was 2 years old and had been let out at the seams once already, and she said nothing about it, and nobody noticed, which was its own kind of answer. The Duke of Ashford arrived on a Thursday. Clara knew because the household knew, because Mrs. Hartwell had tracked his progress from London with the focused intensity of a general following troop movements. And by the time his carriage was reported on the Pembury Road, the Hartwell Park drawing room had been rearranged twice, and Cecily had changed her hair. Clara was in the kitchen garden when he arrived. Not by accident precisely. She had found, over the months, that being elsewhere when things happened at Hartwell Park was often the safest arrangement. She was cutting herbs for Mrs. Pullen, the cook, who was the only person in the house who spoke to Clara as though she were simply a person. "He's here then," Mrs. Pullen said, without looking up from her pot when Clara came back inside. "So it seems. Lord Pembury's having a dinner Friday. Mrs. Hartwell's been invited, Miss Cecily too." A pause. "You as well, I heard." Clara looked up. "The Duke apparently made a particular request," Mrs. Pullen said, with the careful neutrality of someone relaying information they find interesting. "That all members of the household attend. Mrs. Hartwell wasn't best pleased." Clara could imagine. She had not been to a dinner at Pembury House in the 4 months she had lived at Hartwell Park. She was not, as a rule, presented. Did she say why he asked? "Dukes don't explain themselves, do they?" Mrs. Pullen handed her a basket. "Take those up, love." Clara saw him for the first time that Friday evening, across a room full of candlelight and careful conversation. She had expected, she was not sure what she had expected. Something louder, perhaps. The kind of man who filled a room by volume. Cecily had described him in terms that suggested a figure of considerable self-importance, and Mrs. Hartwell's deference to the idea of him had implied something similar. He was not that. Edmund Cavendish, Duke of Ashford, stood near the fireplace with a glass he had not touched and the expression of a man doing arithmetic in his head. He was tall and dark-haired, and had the kind of face that would have been handsome if it arranged itself into something more approachable. It did not. He spoke when spoken to, which was often, and answered in a way that was perfectly correct and gave nothing away. Cecily was introduced to him within the first 10 minutes. Clara watched from across the room as he bowed over her cousin's hand with impeccable manners and said something that made Cecily laugh. He did not laugh himself. Clara was not introduced. This did not surprise her. She had positioned herself near the window, partly from habit and partly because she genuinely preferred it. The room was warm and she could breathe better at the edges of things. She was watching the garden go dark outside when she became aware, quite suddenly, that she was being observed. She turned. The Duke was across the room in conversation with Lord Pembury. He was looking at Lord Pembury, but a moment before she was almost certain he had been looking at her. She told herself she was imagining it. She was not imagining it. Edmund Cavendish had known Clara Ashby would be in this room before he accepted the dinner invitation. He had known her name, her age, her father's name, and the approximate nature of her current circumstances for 6 weeks before setting foot in Wiltshire. He had come because of her, in a manner of speaking, though that was not how he would have described it, and he had no intention of describing it at all. What he had not known, what could not be known from a letter or a legal record or a solicitor's careful summary, was what she was like. He had watched her for 20 minutes now. She stood alone and did not seem distressed by it. She had looked at the room with attention, not longing, the look of someone cataloging rather than coveting. When Mrs. Hartwell had steered Cecily past her without acknowledgement, something had moved across Clara's face and then been put away, quickly and privately, like a thing returned to a drawer. She was not what he had expected. He was not sure yet if that made things simpler or more complicated. Lord Pembury was saying something about the hunting. Edmund agreed that yes, the hunting was very good this time of year and made a note, later that evening in his small leather notebook. It was not yet the night of the bread and the cake. That would come 10 days later at a dinner at Hartwell Park, when Mrs. Hartwell finally and reluctantly included Clara at the table because the Duke had asked again that all members of the household be present. Edmund had asked because he wanted to see what they would do. He had not expected the bread, but he had, by then, stopped being surprised by the Hartwells. The invitation to dine at Hartwell Park had been Edmund's idea. He had suggested it to Mrs. Hartwell with the mild, offhand manner he had learned was most effective with people who needed to believe a thing was their own notion. It would be a pleasure to see the house. A small dinner, nothing formal. The family only. Mrs. Hartwell had agreed with the speed of someone who had been hoping for exactly this, and was now performing reluctance for the sake of dignity. All the family, Edmund had said as he was leaving, pleasantly, as though it were an afterthought. Mrs. Hartwell's smile had not faltered, but something behind it had. Clara was told about the dinner on a Wednesday morning 2 days before. Mrs. Hartwell came to find her in the library, where Clara had been cataloging a set of books that had not been touched in a decade. She stood in the doorway with her hands clasped and delivered the news in the tone one uses to announce an inconvenience. The Duke has expressed a wish for a family dinner. You will of course be included. A pause that carried considerable weight. I trust you have something suitable to wear. Yes, Clara said. She did not elaborate. Mrs. Hartwell waited a moment, as though hoping for something more, gratitude perhaps, or visible anxiety, and then left. Clara looked down at the book in her hands. She had not been to a dinner at Hartwell Park in 4 months. She was not sure if suitable was the right word for her gray dress, which was plain and well-made and had belonged to a version of her life that no longer existed. But it was what she had. She thought about the Duke's request. All the family. She did not know what to make of it. She filed it away with the other things she did not know what to make of, and went back to the books. The evening of the dinner arrived with the particular anxiety of occasions that matter to some people in a room, and not at all to others. Cecily had her hair dressed twice. Mrs. Hartwell wore her garnets. Mr. Hartwell, a quiet man who moved through his own house like a polite stranger, put on his good coat and said very little, which was his custom. Clara wore the gray dress and did her own hair, and came downstairs to find that her place at the table had been set at the far end, beside the Hartwell cousins who were visiting from Bath, and who would speak to her only if directly addressed. The Duke arrived at 7. He greeted Mrs. Hartwell with courtesy and Cecily with the same impeccable, unrevealing politeness Clara had observed at Pembury House. He shook Mr. Hartwell's hand. He was introduced to the cousins. He took his seat at the head of the table. Mrs. Hartwell had arranged this, Clara noted with some efficiency, and the dinner began. Clara watched him the way she watched most things at Hartwell Park, carefully from a distance without appearing to. He ate without enthusiasm. He answered questions about London, about the season, about his estate in Derbyshire, with the patient precision of a man who has answered the same questions many times and long ago ceased to find them interesting. He did not perform. He did not charm. He simply sat there, present and contained, and the room arranged itself around him the way rooms do around people who do not require them to. Cecily was at her best. Clara could see the effort in it, the laugh calibrated to carry just far enough, the questions chosen to display intelligence without intimidating, the way she leaned forward very slightly when he spoke. She was not without skill. Clara had never thought her cousin stupid. The Duke listened, responded. His face remained its careful, unreadable self. Dessert arrived at 9:30. Clara had almost stopped noticing the evening by then. She had spoken perhaps 6 words, eaten what was placed before her, and retreated to the middle distance of her own thoughts, which was where she spent most of her time at Hartwell Park these days. She was thinking about the letter in her father's trunk. She had read it twice more since finding it and still could not parse the full shape of what it meant, only that it felt important in the way that things feel important before you understand why. She was thinking about this when the dessert plates arrived. Lemon cake. She could smell it before she saw it, bright and sweet, the kind of smell that belongs to celebrations. The housemaid moved around the table with the silver tray and Clara watched the plates go down. Lord Pembury, his wife, the cousins, Cecily, Mrs. Hartwell. Then the girl reached Clara. She set down a small plate, white bread, neatly cut, a curl of butter on the side. The table did not go quiet. That was the thing Clara would remember afterward. Nobody stopped talking. Nobody looked. There was no dramatic pause. The cruelty of it was precisely in that. It was too small to notice if you were not the one it was happening to. Mrs. Hartwell's voice, warm and regretful. Tatli sana e gelmes sevgilim. Your digestion, you know, I am only thinking of you. Clara looked at the bread. She was 23 years old. She had buried her father, watched her home emptied, moved into a house where she was tolerated like a draft that could not quite be sealed out. She had learned not to react. She had become very good at it. She picked up the bread and said, "Of course, thank you." She did not look up for a long moment. When she did, only briefly, only to remind herself that the room was still there and she was still in it, her eyes moved without intention to the far end of the table. The Duke was not looking at Cecily. He was not looking at Mrs. Hartwell. He was looking at Clara. Not with pity, not with the performative discomfort of someone who has witnessed something awkward and wishes to appear sensitive. He was looking at her the way one looks at something one is trying to understand, direct and still and intent. Clara dropped her gaze immediately. Her face was warm. She heard, rather than saw, the small sound of a notebook being opened, the quiet scratch of a pen. She did not look up again. What Edmund wrote that night in his small leather notebook was this. She did not flinch. She did not look to anyone for rescue. She simply endured it and kept her dignity, and that tells me everything I needed to know. Below that, underlined once, the Hartwells are worse than I thought. And below that, a name. A solicitor's name in London whom he intended to write to in the morning. Clara did not know any of this. She ate her bread and said nothing and counted the minutes until she could leave the table. And outside the window the Wiltshire night was very dark and very quiet, and the spring was still refusing to come. The morning after the dinner, nothing changed. This was the thing about cruelty that came dressed as kindness. It left no mark you could point to. Clara woke at her usual hour, dressed in her usual way, came down to find Mrs. Hartwell already at breakfast and Cecily still in bed, and the house exactly as it had always been. Nobody mentioned the dinner. Nobody mentioned the bread. The day arranged itself around her with its customary indifference, and Clara moved through it the way she always did, quietly and without friction, like water finding the path of least resistance. Only Mrs. Pullen, when Clara came to the kitchen that afternoon, looked at her for a moment longer than necessary. "You all right, love?" "Perfectly," Clara said. Mrs. Pullen handed her a cup of tea and did not press the matter. This was why Clara liked her. The Duke remained in Wiltshire. This surprised some people and did not surprise others. Lord Pembury was pleased. Cecily was visibly, carefully pleased, in the way she had of feeling things intensely while appearing to feel them only moderately. Mrs. Hartwell began hosting afternoon teas with a frequency that strained the household budget and exhausted the good china. Edmund attended 2 of these teas. He was correct and present and gave nothing away. Clara was not invited to the teas. This was not stated. It was simply arranged, the way things at Hartwell Park were arranged, through omission rather than instruction. She would find herself needed elsewhere when the carriage was heard on the drive. There were always linens to be seen to, or letters to be written for Mrs. Hartwell, or some other task that materialized with convenient timing. She did not mind. Or rather, she had made a decision, sometime in the last 18 months, to not mind things she could not change, and she had become skilled enough at this that she could no longer always tell the difference between genuine indifference and the performance of it. What she noticed, because she noticed everything, was that the Duke sometimes appeared in places that were not the drawing room. The first time, she was in the library. She had returned to cataloging the books. It was her own project, unsanctioned and unnoticed, and she was balanced on the second step of the library ladder with a copy of Fordyce's sermons in one hand and a pencil in the other when she heard the door open. She looked down. The Duke stood in the doorway. They regarded each other for a moment. Clara descended the ladder with as much composure as the situation permitted, which was not a great deal. "I beg your pardon," he said. "I was told this room was unoccupied." "It usually is," Clara said. He looked at the shelves, at the pencil in her hand, at the neat list she had been keeping on a sheet of paper on the reading table. "What are you doing?" "Cataloging," she paused. "Nobody has touched these books in some time. Several are water damaged. I thought someone ought to know which ones." He picked up her list and read it. She watched him do this without knowing what expression she was wearing. "This is thorough," he said. It seemed worth doing properly. He set the list down. He looked at her, that same direct, assessing look she had felt at the dinner table, and then he said, "Forgive the interruption," and left. Clara stood in the library for a moment after the door closed. Then she climbed back up the ladder and went back to work. The second time was in the garden. Clara walked in the mornings when the house was still quiet, before Mrs. Hartwell required anything of her. The kitchen garden, mostly, it was not decorative enough to be fashionable, which meant she had it to herself. She was examining the state of the herb beds which had been neglected, when she became aware of footsteps on the gravel path behind her. She turned, expecting Mrs. Pullen. It was the Duke. He looked, she thought, faintly surprised to see her, but only faintly, and only for a moment. "Miss Ashby." "Your Grace." He fell into step beside her with the ease of a man who does not require an invitation to things. Clara found this irritating and said nothing about it. They walked in silence for a moment. The morning was cool and gray and smelled of damp earth. A blackbird was making a great deal of noise in the hedgerow. "Do you walk here every morning?" he asked. "Yes." "Nobody told me." She looked at him. "Were you looking for me?" A pause. "I was looking for somewhere quiet." This was, she would think later, almost certainly not the full truth. But she had not yet developed the vocabulary for what it might have been instead, and so she accepted it. "The kitchen garden is generally quiet," she said. "You're welcome to it." He made a sound that might have been acknowledgement. They walked a little further. The blackbird continued its complaints. "You know a great deal about plants," he said. It was not a question. He had been watching her hands, she realized, where she had been unconsciously assessing the herbs as she walked. "My mother had a garden," Clara said. "I used to help her." She had not intended to say that. It came out before she had decided to offer it, which was unusual for her. The Duke said nothing for a moment. Then, "What happened to her?" "She died when I was 11. "I'm sorry." It was simply said, not performed. Clara glanced at him sideways and found his face unexpectedly open, not the careful mask of the drawing room but something quieter underneath it. "Thank you," she said. They parted at the garden gate without any further conversation, and Clara went in to help Mrs. Hartwell with her letters and did not think about it for the rest of the morning. She thought about it a great deal in the afternoon. The third time was the one that mattered. Clara was crossing the upstairs hallway with an armful of Mrs. Hartwell's mending when she heard voices below, Mrs. Hartwell's, carrying clearly up the staircase with the unerring acoustic efficiency of the house, and another voice she did not immediately recognize. She stopped. The girl has no prospects worth speaking of, naturally. Her father's situation was quite a delicate pause. Well, one does not wish to be unkind. Clara stood very still. "She is family," Mrs. Hartwell continued, with the satisfaction of someone performing generosity they have no intention of delivering. "We do what we can, but I confess it is a strain. She does not always make herself easy." Clara had heard versions of this before. She had even in her harder moments wondered if it was true. She set her jaw and was about to move on when she heard it, the quality of the silence that followed. It was not an agreeing silence. She heard the Duke say, very evenly, "I see." 2 words, nothing more. But something in them, a temperature, a weight, made Mrs. Hartwell's next sentence come out slightly differently than the one before it. Slightly more careful, as though she had noticed too late that the ground had shifted under her. Clara did not wait to hear the rest. She moved on down the hallway with the mending and did not allow herself to examine what she felt. But that evening at supper, she looked at the Duke across the table only for a moment and found him already looking back. He did not look away first. Neither did she. What Clara did not know, could not have known, was the note Edmund made that same evening. She heard it, she kept walking. She did not flinch, did not seek reassurance, did not change her face. The composure is not performance, it is something she built herself out of necessity. That is different. And then below, Mrs. H is becoming careless. Good. He closed the notebook. Outside, the Wiltshire spring had finally, reluctantly, begun to arrive. May arrived, and with it the particular social acceleration that comes when a season is running out of time. Mrs. Hartwell felt this acutely. Clara could see it in the way she moved through the house faster, sharper, with the compressed energy of someone recalculating. The Duke had been in Wiltshire for 3 weeks. He had attended 4 dinners, 2 teas, 1 afternoon ride on which Cecily had worn her new blue habit and looked genuinely beautiful, and a musical evening at Pembury House where Cecily had played the pianoforte with considerable accomplishment. He had been pleasant throughout all of it. Attentive, correct, entirely unreadable. He had not made an offer. This was, in the Hartwell household, becoming a problem. Cecily came to Clara's room on a Tuesday evening without knocking, which was her habit, and sat on the edge of the bed with her arms folded and the expression she wore when she was thinking about something she had not decided whether to say. Clara set down her book and waited. "He asks about you," Cecily said finally. Clara looked at her. "I beg your pardon." "The Duke." Cecily's voice was even, but her fingers were tight around her own elbow. "He asked Lord Pembury about your father, about the family history. Pembury told Mama." Clara said nothing. "It's strange," Cecily continued. "Don't you think it's strange? He has no reason to." She stopped, started again. "What has he said to you?" "Very little," Clara said, which was almost true. "We have spoken twice, in passing." Cecily studied her for a moment with the focused attention she rarely turned on Clara. It was uncomfortable, like being examined by someone who has previously not thought you worth examining. "He watched you at dinner," Cecily said. "The night of the cake." The word landed between them. Cecily had not mentioned that evening before, neither had Clara. "I didn't notice," Clara said. "Yes, you did." Cecily stood. She was not angry precisely, something more complicated than anger and more honest. "I just want to understand what's happening." "Nothing is happening," Clara said. Cecily looked at her for a long moment. Then she left without another word, and Clara sat in the quiet of her room and listened to the footsteps recede down the hallway and thought about the fact that Cecily was not entirely wrong. The plan, when it came quickly. Clara heard it the way she heard most things at Hartwell Park, incompletely, accidentally, through walls and half-open doors that nobody remembered she might be passing. She had developed over the months an almost involuntary attention to the sounds of the house. It was not eavesdropping so much as survival, knowing where people were, what mood they were in, which rooms to avoid. She was carrying a tray back from Mrs. Hartwell's sitting room when she heard her name. She stopped in the corridor. Mrs. Hartwell's voice, low and quick, "Cannot continue as it is. He is distracted by her presence and I will not have it." A murmur. Mr. Hartwell, she thought, though he rarely contributed much. "My cousin in Shropshire has been looking for a companion, someone reliable, educated, presentable. Clara would suit perfectly." A pause. "It is a kindness, really. She cannot stay here indefinitely. She has no future here." Clara stood very still in the corridor with the tray in her hands. "When?" Mr. Hartwell's voice, quiet and indistinct. "Before the end of the month. I shall write to Cousin Margaret tomorrow." Footsteps moving toward the door. Clara walked. Quickly, silently, around the corner and down the back stairs and through the kitchen and out the side door into the garden, where she stood in the cool evening air and put the tray down on the stone wall and pressed her hands flat against it and breathed. A companion in Shropshire. It was, she understood, the end of everything. Not that Hartwell Park had been much, but it had been something, an address, a connection, the last fraying thread of a life that had once been hers. Shropshire would be nothing, a stranger's house, a stranger's charity. She would disappear into it like a stone dropped into deep water. She stood there for a long time. The garden was very quiet. Somewhere a door opened and closed and she heard the distant sound of the stable horses, and above her the sky was doing something complicated with the last of the light, going gold and then gray and then nothing. She did not cry. She had made a decision about crying some time ago. She picked up the tray and went back inside. She did not see him coming. The garden had been dark for an hour when she came back outside. She had not meant to. She had gone upstairs, sat on her bed, stared at the wall, and found after 20 minutes that the room was too small for what she was feeling. The garden at least had air in it. She was sitting on the stone bench near the far wall, which was invisible from the house, which was why she had chosen it, when she heard footsteps on the gravel. She looked up. The Duke of Ashford stood at the entrance to the garden with his coat on and his hat in his hand, looking at her with the expression of a man who has found something he was not expecting and is deciding how to proceed. Clara stood immediately. Old instinct. "Your Grace, I apologize, I didn't know anyone." "Sit down," he said, not unkindly. He said it the way one says "don't trouble yourself" as a practical instruction rather than a command. Clara sat, mostly because her legs were not entirely reliable at that moment. He remained standing. He looked at the garden, at the sky, at some middle distance that had nothing in it. He did not ask her what was wrong. She was obscurely grateful for this. "I like this part of the garden," he said eventually. "Nobody comes here." "No," Clara agreed. Silence, a not uncomfortable one which surprised her. Then he said without preamble, "You are not happy here." Clara looked at her hands. "That is not." "I am not asking," he said. "I am observing." She was quiet for a moment. "It is not a question of happiness," she said carefully. "I am grateful for—" "Don't," he said. She stopped. "Don't say what you have been trained to say," he said. He was still looking at the middle distance. His voice was even, almost detached, but there was something underneath it. "I have heard it several times now, and I do not think it is true, and I would rather we did not pretend." Clara stared at him. He turned to look at her then fully, with that direct and assessing attention that she had felt before and still could not quite accommodate. "Tell me something true," he said, "about anything. I find I am very tired of conversations that contain no truth whatsoever." Clara looked at him for a long moment. Something in her, the part that had been compressed and careful and silent for so long, that she had almost forgotten it was there, shifted. "I am going to be sent to Shropshire," she said, "as a companion to a woman I have never met, by the end of the month." She paused. "I don't want to go. I have nowhere else to go. I don't know what to do." She stopped. "That is true." The Duke was very still. "Who told you this?" he said. "I heard it." She looked at her hands again. "I hear most things in this house. It is an occupational consequence of being invisible." He said nothing for a moment. When she glanced up, she found his face had done something she had not seen it do before. It had gone hard. Not at her, past her, at something she could not see. "You are not going to Shropshire," he said. Clara blinked. "I beg your pardon." He looked at her. That hard thing in his face was still there, but his voice was level. "You are not going to Shropshire," he said again, as though repetition made it a fact, as though he were the kind of person who could decide things and have them be decided. She stared at him. "You cannot simply—" "Go inside," he said. "Get some sleep." He put his hat on. "I will deal with Mrs. Hartwell." He left. Clara sat on the stone bench in the dark garden for a long time after he had gone, turning the conversation over in her mind like something she had found on the ground and could not identify. "You are not going to Shropshire." She did not know what to make of it. She filed it away with the other things she did not know what to make of: the notebook, the library, the garden, the 2 words spoken in a hallway that had made Mrs. Hartwell's voice go careful. She went inside. She did not sleep. The letter from Shropshire was never written. Clara waited for it with the particular dread of someone expecting bad news they cannot prevent, checking Mrs. Hartwell's mood each morning, listening for the scratch of pen on paper in the sitting room, watching the post tray on the hall table with an attention she hoped nobody noticed. 3 days passed. 4. The tray held invitations, bills, a note from Lord Pembury, a catalogue from a London dressmaker. Nothing from Shropshire. Nothing to Shropshire either, as far as she could tell. Mrs. Hartwell did not mention it. She did not mention Clara at all, which was unusual. Her silences were normally pointed, deliberate, arranged to land. This one had a different quality. It was the silence of someone who had been told something and was deciding how to feel about it. Clara did not ask. She waited and watched and said nothing, and on the 5th morning she woke to find that the dread had not gone but had changed shape, from the sharp fear of something coming to the stranger, more disorienting feeling of something that should have happened and had not. She owed him something for that. She did not know what. The trunk had been sitting in the corner of her room since she arrived at Hartwell Park. It was her father's old brown leather, the brass fittings gone green, his initials stamped on the lid in letters that had once been gold. W.A. William Ashby. She had not been able to bring herself to go through it properly. She had opened it once, taken out the books on top, found the letter underneath them, read the first line, and closed it again. "You must know, William, that I cannot allow this to continue." She had told herself she would read it when she was ready. She had been telling herself this for 4 months. She opened the trunk on a Thursday afternoon when the house was quiet and Mrs. Hartwell was resting and Cecily had gone to call on a friend. She sat on the floor beside it and went through it methodically, the way she catalogued books, carefully, without flinching, item by item. Her father's things were modest: a pocket watch that no longer worked, a set of cufflinks, 3 books on agricultural management that struck her as unbearably sad somehow, evidence of plans he had meant to carry out. A bundle of letters tied with brown string, her mother's, she thought, from the handwriting, and she set those aside without reading them. A ledger, a folded map of the London property, and underneath all of it, where she had found it before, the letter. She unfolded it this time. Read it all the way through, then she read it again. Then she sat on the floor of her room with the letter in her hands, and the trunk open in front of her, and the afternoon light moving slowly across the wall, and she understood that her father had known. The letter was dated 4 years ago. It was from a solicitor, a Mr. Gerald Voss of Voss and Cleary, Gray's Inn, and it was addressed to her father in the careful, precise language of a man who is delivering news he has verified several times before committing it to paper. The substance of it was this. Her father had, 12 years ago, entered into a private financial arrangement with his brother-in-law, Robert Hartwell. A substantial sum, enough to purchase the Hartwell Park estate outright, given not as a loan but as an investment, with a formal agreement that Clara's father would retain a share in the property and its income. The agreement had been drawn up, signed, witnessed, and then over the following years, quietly and methodically dismantled. Mr. Voss laid it out with the grim precision of someone who has spent a long time untangling a deliberate knot. Documents altered, witnesses who could no longer be located. A second agreement, apparently superseding the first, bearing her father's signature, a signature that Mr. Voss described in careful language as presenting certain irregularities that would merit further examination. Her father's money, Hartwell Park, built on her father's money. And below the summary in Mr. Voss's neat hand, I must advise you strongly, Sir William, that this matter warrants immediate legal remedy. The evidence, though partially obscured, is sufficient to pursue. I await your instruction. Clara sat with this for a long time. Her father had received this letter, he had read it, and he had what? Done nothing. She turned the letter over, looking for a copy of his reply, and found nothing. She went back through the trunk, nothing. He had known and he had not acted, and then he had died, and Hartwell had gone on, and she had come here with nothing and been given bread while the others had cake and thanked her aunt for the kindness of it. She folded the letter, put it in the pocket of her dress, closed the trunk. She sat for a moment with her hands in her lap and the room very quiet around her and something moving through her chest that was too large and too complicated to name. It was not grief exactly. She had done most of that grief already. It was something colder, something that required action. She did not know yet what action. She did not know who to trust, who to tell, who would listen to a woman with no money and no standing and a letter from a solicitor 4 years old. But she knew one thing. She was not imagining it. It was real. It had always been real. She almost told him that evening. Edmund had come to call ostensibly to return a book he had borrowed from Mr. Hartwell, which Clara suspected was a pretext, though she could not have said for what. He was in the drawing room for an hour. Clara was not there. She had been in the kitchen helping Mrs. Pullen, who had twisted her ankle and needed assistance with the evening preparations. She was coming up the back stairs when she heard him in the hallway, taking his leave. She stopped on the landing. Through the half-open door she could see the angle of his coat, his hat in his hand. She thought about the letter in her pocket. Tell him. The thought came clearly, surprisingly, without the usual caution that preceded her decisions. Just that. Tell him. Something in her, the same instinct that had made her keep the letter in the first place, was pointing at him with a certainty she did not entirely trust and could not entirely dismiss. She did not move. She heard the front door close. His footsteps on the gravel outside, then the sound of hooves, then nothing. She stood on the landing for a moment longer. Not yet, she thought. Not yet. You do not know enough. You do not know him well enough. You do not know what he would do with it. She went upstairs and put the letter in the back of her writing desk drawer, underneath the book of Psalms that nobody would ever move, and she went down to dinner and ate what was put in front of her and said almost nothing, and across the table Cecily watched her with the careful attention she had turned on her since their conversation in the bedroom, and Mrs. Hartwell was pleasant and solicitous and refilled Clara's water glass herself, which she had never done before. Clara noted this, filed it away. Mrs. H is becoming careless, the Duke had written, though Clara did not know this. He was right. 3 days later she made her decision. She found him in the Pembury House library. Lord Pembury had mentioned, at a dinner, that Edmund spent his mornings there when the weather kept him indoors, and the weather that week was committed to keeping everyone indoors. She had walked the half-mile to Pembury House in the rain with the letter in her pocket and the specific calm of someone who has made a decision and is past the point of reconsidering it. The butler showed her in with mild surprise. Ladies did not generally call at Pembury House unaccompanied at 10 in the morning. Clara thanked him pleasantly and waited. Edmund came down the stairs looking as though he had not expected her, which she thought was probably true. He stopped at the foot of the stairs, looked at her wet coat, her expression, the set of her jaw. "Miss Ashby." "I need to show you something," Clara said. "I should have done it sooner. I am not certain I should be doing it now, but I have been thinking about it for 3 days and I cannot think of anyone else," and she stopped. "I found a letter in my father's things." He was very still. "Come in," he said. He led her to the library and closed the door, and she took the letter from her pocket and held it out to him, and he took it and read it, and she watched his face while he did. He read it twice. His expression did not change. This, she had learned, meant a great deal. When he looked up, his eyes were very dark and very steady. "Where did you find this?" he said. "In my father's trunk, underneath his books." "Has anyone else seen it?" "No." He looked at the letter again. Something moved across his face, not surprise, she thought. Something more like confirmation. The expression of someone who has suspected a thing for a long time and has just been handed the proof of it. "Miss Ashby," he said. He set the letter down on the desk between them. "I need to tell you something." Clara looked at him. "I have known about the arrangement between your father and Robert Hartwell for some time," he said. His voice was even, careful. "Not the full extent of it, not this," he gestured at the letter, "but enough to know that something was wrong. That is part of why I came to Wiltshire." Clara stared at him. "Part of why," she said. He met her eyes. "Yes." The words settled between them. "What is the other part?" Clara said. He was quiet for a moment. The rain against the library windows was very loud. "That," he said, "is a longer conversation." Clara looked at him, at this man who had watched her from the end of a dinner table, who had appeared in libraries and gardens, who had written things in a small notebook she had never seen, who had told her she was not going to Shropshire, and had apparently made that true simply by deciding it. "I have time," she said. The longer conversation did not happen that day. Edmund had begun, had opened his mouth, had looked at her with the expression of a man organizing something complicated into speakable order, when Lord Pembury's voice came from the hallway, loud and cheerful and entirely oblivious, calling for Edmund about something to do with horses. The moment collapsed. Edmund's face went back to its careful, neutral arrangement. He folded the letter and handed it back to her with instructions to keep it safe and tell no one. And by the time Lord Pembury appeared in the library doorway, Clara was already standing with her coat back on, and her face composed, and the letter in her pocket. Lord Pembury was surprised to see her, but not unpleasantly so. He invited her to stay for tea. She declined politely. She walked back to Hartwell Park in the rain with the letter against her ribs and the unfinished conversation sitting in her chest like a held breath. "That is part of why I came to Wiltshire." Part. She turned it over for days. She was good at waiting, she had become very good at it, but this particular waiting had a different quality to it. It was not the passive waiting of someone with no power. It was the waiting of someone who has been handed a piece of a map and is now looking for the rest of it. Edmund, meanwhile, was having a problem. He had not intended to tell her as much as he had. He had a plan. He had always had a plan, carefully constructed over months, built on the quiet accumulation of evidence and the patient maneuvering of pieces into position. And Clara Ashby had not, strictly speaking, been scheduled to know about it yet. She had been scheduled to be protected by it, which was different. But she had walked into the Pembury Library with a letter he had not known existed, and a jaw set with the specific determination of someone who has decided to trust a person and is not entirely sure they should, and he had found himself telling her things before he had finished deciding to. This was, he recognized, information about himself. He wrote in his notebook, "She is not waiting to be rescued. Adjust accordingly." He underlined it once. Then he sat for a while looking out the library window at the rain, and thinking about the fact that adjusting accordingly was considerably easier to write than to execute, because adjusting accordingly meant telling her the rest of it, and the rest of it was complicated, and some of it reflected poorly on his methods, and he found, unexpectedly, inconveniently, that he cared what she thought of his methods. He was still thinking about this when Cecily Hartwell's note arrived. It was a perfectly correct note, beautifully written in the accomplished hand that Miss Hartwell had clearly practiced. It invited him to call at Hartwell Park on Thursday afternoon, where there was to be a small gathering of local families, nothing formal. They would be so pleased to have him, signed with the appropriate flourishes. It was also, he understood immediately, a move. Cecily had been watching him. She was not stupid. He had always known she was not stupid, and she had decided that waiting was no longer in her interest. He accepted the invitation. He arrived on Thursday to find a drawing room full of the local families as promised, arranged with the unconscious precision of a battlefield. Cecily at the center of it, radiant and prepared. Mrs. Hartwell circling with the focused hospitality of a woman who has invested heavily in an outcome. Clara, he found her immediately, before he found anyone else, which told him something. In the corner near the window with a cup of tea she was not drinking, wearing her gray dress, watching the room with those careful eyes. She did not look at him when he came in. He greeted the room, accepted tea, was drawn into a conversation about the county roads with two gentlemen who had strong opinions, and waited. The trap, when it came from an unexpected direction. Mrs. Hartwell found him alone, or nearly alone, in the hallway between the drawing room and the small sitting room adjacent, where he had retreated briefly from the county roads conversation. She appeared at his elbow with the smooth inevitability of a woman who has been waiting for exactly this configuration of circumstance. "Your Grace," she said, with the warm, concerned intimacy of someone about to confide, "I hope you will forgive me. There is something I have been meaning to say, and I fear I have been too delicate about it." Edmund looked at her pleasantly. "Please." She arranged her face. It was a skilled performance, something between regret and protectiveness, with a note of reluctant honesty. "It is about Clara," she said. "My niece." He said nothing. This was a technique he had refined over years, the silence that people rushed to fill. "I am very fond of the girl," Mrs. Hartwell said. "Naturally, she is family, but I feel I would be failing in my duty to her, and indeed to you, if I did not mention certain things." She lowered her voice. "Her father's situation, as I imagine you know, was quite serious. But what is perhaps less known, a delicate pause, is that Clara was aware of it, for some time before his death. There were debts she concealed, obligations she chose not to disclose to the family. We discovered this only after the fact." Another pause. "She is a proud girl, perhaps too proud, and pride in someone with so little left to be proud of can sometimes manifest in ways that are," she sighed, "difficult." Edmund looked at her steadily. "I tell you this," Mrs. Hartwell said, "only because I have noticed your kindness to her, and I would not wish you to be deceived by an appearance of simplicity. She is not simple, Your Grace. She is quite intelligent, and intelligence without character is a dangerous thing in a woman of her circumstances." She delivered this last line with the satisfied finality of someone placing a card they have been holding for some time. Then she smiled, touched his arm briefly, and went back to her guests. Edmund stood in the hallway. He was very still for a moment. Then he went back to the drawing room. Clara felt the change immediately. It was not dramatic. He did not ignore her or cut her publicly or do anything that could be pointed to and named. But she had spent months learning to read the small gradations of a household's temperature, and Edmund Cavendish had spent enough time in her peripheral awareness that she had, without meaning to, learned to read him too. He was different. Cooler, the quality of his attention had shifted. When he spoke to her briefly near the window, a perfectly correct exchange about the weather and the state of the roads, his eyes did not settle the way they usually did. They moved, as though he were rechecking something. Clara felt it like cold water, the specific cold of something you thought was solid turning out not to be. She kept her face still. She answered his questions about the weather. She smiled at the appropriate moments. She was, she thought, very good at this by now. She went upstairs when the gathering ended and sat on her bed and looked at the wall. What did she say to him? Not a question. She knew who. She knew there had been a conversation in the hallway. She had seen Mrs. Hartwell detach from the room with that particular purposeful glide, and she had noted it and filed it and hoped she was wrong. She had not been wrong. She did not know the specifics. She did not need them. The architecture of it was familiar. She had watched Mrs. Hartwell construct these conversations before about other people, and she knew the shape they took. Sympathetic, concerned, reluctantly honest. The kind of thing that left no fingerprints because it never said anything that could be directly refuted. She thought about going to him, explaining, defending herself against an accusation she could only guess at. The thought lasted approximately 4 seconds. She would not. She would not chase him down and present her case like a defendant before a judge. She would not give Mrs. Hartwell the satisfaction of having provoked that. And she would not, she understood this about herself clearly and without sentimentality, she would not beg anyone to think well of her. She had done enough invisible work maintaining her dignity in this house. She would not spend it on that. She went to bed. She slept badly. He came to find her the next morning. She was in the kitchen garden, where else, moving through the herb beds with the focused energy of someone who needs to be doing something with their hands. She heard his footsteps on the gravel and did not turn around. "Miss Ashby." "Your Grace." She kept her hands in the rosemary. "If you have come to tell me something Mrs. Hartwell has said, I would ask you not to. Whatever it was, I have no doubt it was very well constructed, and I cannot refute it without knowing its precise contents, and I find I don't have the appetite for it this morning." Silence behind her. She turned then, because facing away felt like a defeat, and found him standing a few feet away looking at her, with an expression she had not seen on his face before. "She told me you had concealed your father's debts deliberately," he said. "That you were aware of his situation long before his death and chose not to disclose it to the family." Clara looked at him steadily. "That is not true." "I know," she blinked. "Then why?" "Because I was angry," he said, "and I allowed it to affect my behavior toward you yesterday, and I am telling you now so that you don't spend another night constructing theories about what you did wrong." His voice was level, almost flat, but something underneath it was not flat at all. "You did nothing wrong. The fault was mine." Clara stared at him. This was not, she had not prepared for this. She had prepared for justifications, for the careful distancing language of someone extracting themselves from an association that had become inconvenient. She had not prepared for this. "You were angry," she said slowly, "at her or at me?" "At myself," he said, "for being, briefly, susceptible to exactly the kind of manipulation I came here specifically to document." A pause. The morning was cool and bright, and a bee was doing something industrious in the lavender. "You came here to document it," Clara said. "Among other things, part of why." She looked at him for a long moment. He met her gaze with that steady, direct attention that she had stopped finding uncomfortable and now found something else entirely, something she did not have a name for yet. "You said you needed to tell me something," she said. "In the library, before Lord Pembury came in." "Yes. I think," Clara said carefully, "that it is time you told me the rest of it." Edmund was quiet for a moment. He looked at the garden, at the house beyond it, at her. "Yes," he said, "I think it is." They sat on the stone bench, her stone bench, she thought, with a private and slightly startled sense of possession, and he told her. It began, he said, with her father. Not a friendship exactly, they had not been close enough in age or circumstance for friendship. But Edmund's father had known Sir William Ashby and had respected him, and when Sir William died, Edmund had been the one to oversee the winding up of certain joint business affairs, and it was in that process that a name had surfaced. Hartwell, and a discrepancy. Small at first, then larger, then too large to be an error. He had begun making inquiries, quietly through his solicitor, through contacts in the legal community. He had found Mr. Voss's correspondence, not the letter itself, which he had not known existed, but references to it, to an ongoing matter that had been opened and then gone mysteriously silent. He had found the outline of what Hartwell had done, not the proof, the outline. "I needed evidence," he said, "documentary evidence that could stand up to legal scrutiny. Hartwell is careful. He has spent years making the original arrangement difficult to trace. The altered documents are convincing. The witnesses are gone." He paused. "What I needed was something original, something from your father's possession that predated the alterations." Clara was very still. "The letter," she said. "I didn't know about the letter, but yes, something like it. Something in your father's hand or addressed to him that established the original terms of the arrangement." He looked at her. "That is why I came to Wiltshire. I believed that if your father had kept records, and I believed he had, because the man Mr. Voss described was methodical, careful, they would be with you. Or with Hartwell, which would be considerably more difficult." Clara was quiet for a moment. The bee had moved on to the mint. "So you came here to find evidence," she said, "and I was the means of finding it." It was not quite an accusation. It was a question with an edge on it. Edmund was quiet for a moment. When he answered, his voice was measured, but something in it had changed. The careful flatness had given way to something more effortful, as though being precise was costing him something. "That is how it began," he said. "Yes." "And now," he looked at her directly, "now it is considerably more complicated than that." Clara held his gaze for a long moment. She was thinking about the note in the library, the garden. The morning he had said, "Tell me something true," and she had, and he had listened as though what she said mattered. She was thinking about the bread and the cake and the fact that he had been the only person in that room who had written something down. She was thinking about how it felt to be seen by someone who was also, at the same time, watching. "More complicated how?" she said. "In the way," he said, with the careful precision of a man who has decided to be honest and is discovering it is harder than he anticipated, that things become complicated when one comes somewhere for one reason and finds, while there, reasons one did not expect. The garden was very quiet. "That," Clara said after a moment, "is either the most oblique thing anyone has ever said to me or the most honest." Something moved across his face, not quite a smile, the shape of one. "I am working on it," he said. She did not sleep badly that night. She lay awake, but differently, not with the tight, cold wakefulness of dread, but with something that had more air in it. Something that felt, cautiously and against her better judgment, like the first far edge of hope. She thought about what he had told her, about her father, about the plan, about the evidence she was holding in her writing desk drawer under the Book of Psalms, which turned out to be exactly what he needed, which meant that she had, without knowing it, without anyone telling her to, already done the most important thing. She thought about it as considerably more complicated than that. She thought about the way he had looked when he said it, as though the complication was not unwelcome. She turned over. The room was dark and quiet, and outside the window the Wiltshire night smelled of late spring, of things that had finally decided to grow. She had been in this house for 7 months. She had been invisible for 7 months, patient and careful and compressed into the smallest possible space, taking up as little room as she could manage, hoping that smallness would protect her. She thought, enough. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough. She did not know yet what would come next. She did not know how the legal matter would unfold, or what Edmund's plan required of her, or what considerably more complicated would look like when it arrived at its conclusion. She did not know if she was being practical or foolish or something in between. But she knew the letter existed. She knew what it contained. She knew it was real and true and hers. And she let herself know this, finally, in the dark of the room, that the man who had watched her from the end of a dinner table and written something in a small leather notebook had not come to Wiltshire only for a document. She closed her eyes. Outside, something was beginning. The plan required 10 days. Edmund explained this on the stone bench the following morning. 10 days to bring Voss up from London, to prepare the legal documentation, to build a case that would not simply inconvenience Robert Hartwell but dismantle him entirely. The letter alone was not sufficient. It established that her father had received counsel, nothing more. But combined with what Edmund had been assembling for months, it was the foundation everything else required. "What do you need from me?" Clara said. He paused. She had noticed he did this, recalibrated when she asked direct questions, as though he kept expecting her to ask something different. "Your permission to use the letter, your cooperation with Voss when he arrives, and 10 days of patience." "I have been patient for 18 months, Clara said. 10 days is manageable." There was one condition. The Hartwells could not know. Nothing at Hartwell Park could change. She must behave exactly as she always had. "You mean I must continue to be invisible?" she said. "Yes." She held his gaze. The irony of it sat between them, acknowledged and unspoken. The thing she had spent months wishing to escape was now the most useful tool she had. "I can do that," she said. For 7 of the 10 days she was perfect. Linens, letters, flowers, meals. She moved through the house with her customary quiet, said almost nothing, kept her face in its neutral register. She did not see Edmund. This had been agreed upon. One note arrived through Mrs. Pullen, brief and correct. "Voss arrives Thursday. All in order." Clara burned it in her bedroom fireplace. It was on the 8th day that it went wrong. She had been looking for Mrs. Hartwell's reading glasses when she passed the study door and heard her name. She stopped. 2 voices, Hartwell and someone she didn't recognize. "Making inquiries. Voss has been contacted. He is traveling north." A pause. "And Cavendish is behind it," not a question. "Cavendish has been in correspondence with Voss for 8 months. His arrival in Wiltshire is not coincidental." Then Hartwell, quieter. "The girl, does she know?" "Unknown, but she may have documents." A silence, then, "Find out." Clara walked, quickly and silently, down the corridor and up the back stairs and into her room, where she stood with her back against the door and her heart loud in her chest. They knew, not everything, not the letter specifically, not that she had already given it to Edmund, but enough to start looking. She put the letter in her pocket. She was not leaving it in the room. She went downstairs to supper. Hartwell was entirely pleasant at the table. He asked about the garden, whether she found Wiltshire agreeable. Clara answered in the right places with the right words and smiled in the right way, and across the table the unfamiliar man, Grice, she would learn later, someone Hartwell used for things that didn't get written down, watched her with the careful attention of someone conducting an assessment. She gave him nothing to find. At 9:15 she was in the kitchen. Mrs. Pullen listened without surprise. "Grice has been here before," she said. "Years ago." She untied her apron. "My nephew does the early deliveries. He can go to Pembury House tonight." "Thank you," Clara said. Mrs. Pullen looked at her for a moment. "You all right, love?" Clara looked at the kitchen floor. "I am frightened," she said. "Not of Hartwell, of it coming apart, of there being nothing on the other side of this." Mrs. Pullen was quiet. Then, with the brisk and genuine kindness that was her particular form of affection, "There's something on the other side of this. I've had eyes in my head this last month." She handed Clara a candle. "Go to bed. Let my nephew do his job. Let the Duke do his." Edmund received the message at 11 o'clock. He read it twice and then wrote 3 letters to Voss, moving his arrival forward, to his London solicitor, activating instructions prepared for exactly this contingency, and to a magistrate in the county who owed him a favor and was, more importantly, a man of genuine principle. He sent his man out into the night with all 3. Then he sat for a while. He thought about Clara at the supper table, carrying a letter in her pocket that could dismantle the household around her and giving no indication of it whatsoever. He thought about the night of the lemon cake, the one unguarded second before she put everything away and picked up the bread and thanked her aunt for it. He had seen everything she was not permitted to show, moving across her face like weather. He had found, sitting at that dinner table, that he was furious on her behalf. He had not expected that. He had expected to observe, to document, to execute a plan in which Clara Ashby was a practical necessity, a source of evidence, a person to be protected as part of a larger objective. He had not expected her to be herself. The library ladder, the kitchen garden. "Tell me something true." The way she asked direct questions and waited for direct answers and did not fill silence with performance. Somewhere around the 3rd week he had found himself adjusting the plan. Not its objectives, those remained fixed, but its edges, the parts that concerned her. He had begun thinking not just about what the plan required of her, but about what came after, about the fact that after existed and that she would be in it. He closed the notebook. Outside, the Wiltshire night was dark and still. Voss arrived Wednesday morning. He was a small, precise man of 60 with careful eyes, and he came with a leather satchel he did not put down. They spent 4 hours at the library table, the letter, Voss's original notes, the documents Edmund's solicitor had been assembling for months. Thursday, Edmund sent a note directly to Hartwell Park addressed to Miss Clara Ashby, not through Mrs. Pullen, a small, deliberate placement of a flag, "This afternoon, Pembury House Library. Bring the letter, everything is ready." Voss stood when she came in. "Miss Ashby, I knew your father." "I know," Clara said. "He kept your letter." Something moved across Voss's face. He was a good man. He found it very difficult to believe that someone he had trusted could have done what Hartwell did. "Yes," Clara said. "I think that is probably true." She sat down and put the letter on the table. "Is it enough?" she said. Voss looked up. "It is more than enough." Clara looked at Edmund, who was standing by the window watching her, not Voss, not the letter, her. "What happens now?" she said. "The magistrate arrives at 3. Hartwell will be presented with the documentation. He will have 2 choices, full restitution and a quiet withdrawal, or proceedings that will be considerably less quiet." He paused. "Men like Hartwell choose the private exit when one is available." "And Cecily," Edmund was quiet a moment, "that is not something I can control." "I know, I wasn't asking you to." Clara looked at the window. "She is not her mother. I don't want her destroyed." "She won't be pursued," he said. "I can promise you that." "There is something I want to ask you," Clara said. Voss developed an immediate need to consult his satchel. Edmund came away from the window and sat across from her. "The notebook," Clara said. "The night of the dinner. What did you write?" He reached into his coat, opened the notebook to a page near the beginning, and turned it to face her. She did not flinch. She did not look to anyone for rescue. She simply endured it and kept her dignity, and that tells me everything I needed to know. And below it, underlined, "The Hartwells are worse than I thought." And below that, a name, Voss, write tomorrow. Clara sat back. She thought about the sequence of it, the bread, the notebook, the letter written the following morning. 8 months of preparation before he had ever set foot in Wiltshire. "You were always going to help me," she said, "even if I had not had the letter." "Yes." "Why?" He looked at her directly. "Because your father trusted me with the knowledge of what Hartwell had done, and because," he stopped, started again. "Because I sat at a table and watched a woman be given bread while the others had cake, and she picked it up and said thank you, and I found that I was not willing to be another person who watched and did nothing." The room was very still. "That," Clara said quietly, "is the most honest thing anyone has said to me in a very long time." "I am working on saying honest things," he said. "I find it easier with you than with most people." "Yes," Clara said, "I find the same." The magistrate arrived at 3 o'clock. Clara was not there for that part. She didn't need to see Hartwell's face when the documents were laid before him. She had enough already in the simple fact of the thing being done. She walked home. Halfway back she stopped on the road and looked out at the fields and thought about her father. About him reading Voss's letter and knowing what it meant and not knowing somehow how to act on it. She did not feel angry. She felt something quieter and more final than anger. "I did the thing you couldn't do," she thought. "It's done now." She walked the rest of the way to Hartwell Park and went upstairs and was quiet for a long time. When she came down for supper, Robert Hartwell was not at the table. Mrs. Hartwell served the meal with a face like a mask. Cecily said almost nothing. Clara ate everything placed before her, including the dessert, apple tart, which she ate slowly and with deliberate attention, and the meal passed in the particular silence of something that has been broken and is only now revealing the shape of what it was. Robert Hartwell was gone by Friday morning. Not fled, that would have been dramatic, and Hartwell was not a dramatic man. He had simply, quietly, ceased to be present. His study door was closed. His place at breakfast was empty. Mrs. Hartwell presided over the table with a composure that Clara recognized as the last expensive garment of a woman who has nothing left but the appearance of dignity, and Clara did not disturb it. Cecily did not come down at all. The formal documentation arrived that afternoon, delivered by Voss's associate to Hartwell Park, with the brisk efficiency of men who have been waiting a long time to do a thing, and are relieved to finally be doing it. Clara sat in the small parlor with Voss and Edmund, and a fire that nobody had thought to light, but that Mrs. Pullen had lit anyway, and listened to the legal summary of what she already knew. The original arrangement between her father and Robert Hartwell, the altered documents, the forged signature, the income drawn from the estate for 12 years, the accumulated sum of which was, when Voss read it aloud, larger than Clara had imagined. "Hartwell has agreed to full restitution," Voss said. "The terms are being drawn up. The London property cannot be recovered. It has been sold twice over, but its value will be returned. The income, and a portion of Hartwell Park itself, which your father's original investment effectively built." Clara sat with this. "He agreed without objection," she said. "He agreed," Edmund said, "because the alternative was a public proceeding that would have destroyed not only him but his family's name entirely. He chose what men like him always choose." "The private exit," Clara said. "Yes." She looked at the fire. She thought about her father's pocket watch that no longer worked, the agricultural books, the plans he had made and not carried out. "Is it over?" she said. "Legally," Voss said, "it will take some months to finalize, but the substance of it, yes, it is over." Edmund stayed after Voss left. They sat in the small parlor with the fire Mrs. Pullen had lit, and for a while neither of them said anything, which was comfortable in the way that silences are comfortable between people who have stopped needing to fill them. "You should know," Edmund said eventually, "that I intend to call on you properly with the appropriate formalities." He paused. "I am mentioning it now so that it is not a surprise." Clara looked at him. "You are telling me in advance." "I find that you prefer to know things in advance." I do, she said. Yes, she looked at the fire. And yet you watched me for weeks before telling me anything at all. That, he said, was a failure of method I intend to correct. She was quiet for a moment. You said in the library that it had become more complicated than you expected. Yes. How complicated? He looked at her with that direct, steady attention that she had entirely stopped wanting to look away from. Considerably, he said, in the way that things become complicated when one discovers that a plan one constructed around a person bears very little resemblance to the person themselves. And the person is more complicated than the plan accounted for. The person, he said, is more than the plan accounted for, in every way. Clara held his gaze. She thought about the bread, the notebook, the stone bench, and you are not going to Shropshire, and the morning he had said, "Tell me something true," and she had, and he had listened as though it mattered. She thought about what it had cost this last year, what had been taken and what had been kept, what she had built in the silence of a house that was never hers, out of nothing but her own refusal to disappear. I would like, she said carefully, for the proper call to happen soon. Something shifted in his face, that shape that was almost a smile. Monday, he said. Monday, Clara agreed. She told Cecily herself. She did not have to. She could have let it reach her cousin through the ordinary channels of household information, which would have been easier and not undeserved. But she found, when she thought about it, that she did not want to do it that way. She knocked on Cecily's door that evening and went in and sat in the chair by the window and said, plainly and without embellishment, what had happened and what would follow. Cecily sat on the edge of her bed and listened with a face that went through several things before arriving at something that was not quite grief and not quite relief, but lived in the territory between them. When Clara finished, Cecily was quiet for a long moment. I knew, Cecily said finally, that something was wrong with the money. I didn't know the extent of it, but she stopped. I chose not to look. Yes, Clara said, I know. I was not kind to you. No, Clara said. You weren't. Cecily looked at her hands. I don't suppose there is anything to be done about that now. There isn't, Clara said. But I'm not telling you this to punish you. I'm telling you because you will need to know, and I thought you deserved to hear it from me rather than from a solicitor. Cecily looked up. Her eyes were very bright, but she did not cry, and Clara thought that in another life, under different circumstances, this woman might have been someone worth knowing. What will happen to us? Cecily said. Your father has agreed to terms that protect the household from public proceedings. You will be, Clara paused. You will be all right. It will be reduced and different, and you will have to make adjustments, but you will not be destitute. She stood. Which is more than your parents left me. She said it without cruelty, simply as a fact, a thing that existed between them now that could either be acknowledged or ignored, and she preferred acknowledgement. Cecily said nothing. Clara left. Monday came clear and warm, the best morning Wiltshire had produced all spring. Edmund arrived at 11 o'clock with the correct formalities, his card presented at the door, a brief and perfectly proper exchange with Mrs. Hartwell, who received him with the wan graciousness of someone who has run out of alternative strategies. He was shown to the drawing room. Clara came downstairs in her gray dress, which was plain and well-made and 2 years old, and which she wore without apology. He stood when she came in. He looked at her the way he had looked at her since the beginning, directly, steadily, as though she were something worth the full weight of his attention. They sat. He said the correct things in the correct order, with the formal language that the occasion required, and Clara listened to all of it and thought about how strange it was that language this old and this structured could contain something this new and this specific. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. You watched me for weeks, she said, before you said a word. I did, he said. I have explained my reasons. You have, she looked at him. I have a condition, he waited. "No more watching from the end of the table," she said. "Whatever comes next, I want to be told things, directly and in advance. I have had enough of being managed from a distance by people who believed they knew what was best for me." "That is entirely fair," he said, and entirely agreed. "Then yes," Clara said. "My answer is yes." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, with the particular quiet of someone saying something they have been carrying for some time, "I have been hoping you would say that since approximately the 3rd week of April." "The 3rd week of April," Clara said. "That is very specific." "I am a specific person," he said. "You knew that." "I did," she said, and smiled fully, without reserve, without the careful management she had practiced for so long that it had become automatic. It felt, she thought, like setting something down that had been heavy. He smiled back. It was the first time she had seen him do it without qualification. The house in Derbyshire was large and old and full of light in the mornings, which Clara had not expected, and which she found, every day, to be a thing worth noticing. She had a garden, a real one, her own, which she had begun reorganizing in October with the focused energy of someone who has been waiting a long time to put their hands in good soil. She had a desk by the window in the library where she sat in the mornings. She had keys to rooms she was never told to stay out of. She had, after 23 years of learning to take up as little space as possible, the daily and still slightly startling experience of a life built to her own proportions. She was happy. She was learning, slowly, to let that be simple. The dinner that autumn was a large one, neighbors, county families, a handful of people up from London. The table was long and set beautifully, and Clara sat at the head of it, which still occasionally surprised her, and looked down its length at 20 people eating and talking and laughing in the candlelight. A woman to her left, a neighbor's wife, pleasant, well-meaning, leaned in over dessert. "I heard the most extraordinary story about you," the woman said, with the confidential warmth of someone sharing something they have found delicious. "Someone told me, I can't remember who, about a dinner years ago, before your marriage, that you were made to eat bread while the others had cake." She laughed gently as though it were a charming anecdote. "Can you imagine?" Clara looked at her for a moment. Then she picked up her spoon and took a slow, unhurried bite of the lemon cake on her plate and smiled. "I can imagine," she said pleasantly. "More cake," the woman accepted, baffled and charmed and not entirely sure what had just happened. From the other end of the table, Edmund watched. Clara felt it, that particular attention, familiar now as her own heartbeat. She looked up and found him already looking, the way he always was, the way he had been since the very beginning. He raised his glass slightly just for her. She did not look down. She raised hers back. "Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. If you enjoyed one of our stories, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. And if you'd like to support the channel, you can join as a member or send a super thanks or super chat. Your support helps us continue creating more stories like this. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories. Before we go, we just want to say thank you. When this channel started, these were simply stories we loved telling. We never imagined that so many people from all around the world would spend their evenings listening to them with us. Together, we've now shared well over 100 stories. Some have made us smile, some have made us angry, and some have stayed with us long after they ended. But what has mattered most has been reading your comments and seeing how many of you have connected with these characters and their journeys. Whether you've been here since the beginning or you found us today, thank you for being part of this little community we've built together. Every view, every kind word, and every thoughtful comment means more than you probably realize. We truly appreciate that you choose to spend a little of your time with our stories.